Ever get that urge? You know, like you just want to grab a map and set off to find a lost city.
Yeah, like a real adventure, like Indiana Jones stuff.
Exactly. And today's deep dive, it's going to scratch that itch. We're not talking about, fictional cities like Atlantis or El Dorado. This is about a real place, a place shrouded in mystery.
A place called Armanum.
Armanum, exactly. And what's so fascinating is that we're trying to piece together this ancient puzzle, right? But we're not just using legends and myths. We're using hard evidence. Like we're talking about archaeological digs, ancient inscriptions, the real deal.
We're talking about clues left behind by people who lived thousands of years ago.
Okay, so we're diving headfirst into the world of ancient Near Eastern archaeology. And our trusty sidekick for this deep dive is this, well, it's a pretty dense scholarly article, to be honest. It's called The Localization of Naram-Sin's Armanum.
Catchy title, right?
Oh, academics. But trust me, this is way more exciting than it sounds. We're talking about power struggles, ancient boasts, a city that vanished from history. It's a real historical thriller.
Well, a city that might not have vanished entirely.
Oh, okay. No spoilers. You're right. But seriously, folks, to understand why archaeologists are so obsessed with finding Armanum, we need to rewind the clock way back. Picture this. It's around 2250 BC. Naram-Sin, the king of the Akkadian Empire, which, by the way, was a huge deal back then. He's conquering everything in sight. He's like the rock star, the conquering hero of his time.
And like any good rock star, he wanted everyone to know it.
Exactly. No Twitter or Instagram back then. So what's a king to do? He gets an inscription carved, boasting about his victories. But this wasn't just any old I'm awesome inscription. This one specifically mentions two cities he conquered, Armanum and Ibla.
And this inscription, it's key because it gives us more than just names on a stone. Naram-Sin goes into detail about Armanum. He describes its defenses. Multiple walls, their heights even measured in cubits, which, and I know some of you are wondering, that was an ancient unit of measurement.
Based on the length of a forearm, right?
You got it. So it really gives you a sense of how seriously they took defense back then. It's like they wanted to make sure Armanum was practically impenetrable.
Like ancient blueprints carved into stone. And get this. He also casually mentions a river near Armanum, which, well, that little detail, that's going to come back in a big way later. So archaeologists, they know about this inscription. They also know Ibla was a real city because, well, they found it.
But Armanum, gone, missing in action.
Vanished. Poof, like a ghost city. For centuries, it was just this name and an inscription, lost to the sands of time.
That is, until archaeologists got a new lead in the 1970s.
Ooh, a plot twist.
Kind of, yeah. They discovered thousands of clay tablets at, remember Ibla? The city mentioned alongside Armanum. Well, these tablets, they were like finding a library, a time capsule from that period. We call them the Ibla archives.
So like, imagine stumbling upon the Library of Alexandria, but for this specific period in ancient history. That's the kind of impact these tablets had.
Exactly. These tablets, they gave us this incredible glimpse into daily life back then. The politics, the trade, all the good stuff.
All the juicy details.
And remember how Naram-Sin mentioned that river near Armanum? Well, guess what? The Ibla tablets, they mention a powerful, influential city, a city called Armi. But there's a catch, its exact location, also a mystery.
Armi, Armanum. Okay, I see where you're going with this. Could they be one and the same? Like maybe the name changed over time?
It's definitely a possibility. Names change, but they're often echoes of the original. Think about it. What if we're trying to piece together American history centuries from now and we found mentions of New Amsterdam?
We might just put two and two together and say, hey, that's New York City. So we've got this potential connection, right? Armi from the Ibla tablets. Maybe it's our long-lost Armanum.
Yeah.
But it gets even more interesting when you factor in the political landscape of the time.
Right.
Right. Because the Ibla tablets tell us that Armi, this wasn't just some like sleepy little village. Armi was a big deal. It was a major power player in the region.
They were engaged in trade, diplomacy, all that Game of Thrones stuff, right?
Except with, chariots instead of dragons. But yeah, trade routes, alliances, rivalries. This was the ancient Near East. We're not talking about isolated villages.
Yeah.
We're talking about a whole network of interconnected cities, all vying for power and influence.
It was a cutthroat world back then. So conquering a city like Armi, that would have been huge.
Oh, absolutely. Worthy of boasting about, for sure. Worthy of an inscription or two, or, a whole wall of inscriptions. Right. So we've got this tantalizing clue from the Ibla tablets. But do we have any actual, on-the-ground evidence to back this up? Like, is there a place that could be our Armi Armanum?
Well, about that, things are about to get really interesting.
So there's this place, right, and it might just hold the key to this whole mystery. It's called Banat-Banzi in modern-day Syria.
And let me tell you, Bazi, it's not just some random spot on the map, but the thing that really grabs your attention is this, well, it's a citadel, a really prominent one. Basically a heavily fortified area built up high on a steep hill.
Talk about a power move.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, imagine you're the ruler sitting up there looking out over everything. You've got the high ground, literally. Talk about a statement.
And just like Naram-Sin described in his little inscription, guess what Bazi happens to be near?
Don't tell me. A river.
Bingo. A river. It's like those ancient blueprint carvings were leading us straight to it, right? But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still got those measurements to consider. Remember, Naram-Sin, he was very specific about the heights of the walls, the hill itself.
Oh, yeah, those cubit measurements. They're back. And that's where things get a little tricky, because the article, it goes into detail comparing those measurements from the inscription to Bazi's actual layout. And it even has diagrams.
Visual learners, rejoice. We'll be sure to include those in the show notes.
But the thing is, researchers, they don't all agree on what those measurements actually refer to. Like, are we talking horizontal distance here? Slope length? It's like trying to follow a recipe where the units are, well, open to interpretation.
A pinch of this, a smidgen of that.
Exactly. And that's what's so fascinating about archaeology, right? It's not just about digging stuff up. It's about interpreting the clues, trying to solve a puzzle with, well, sometimes a lot of missing pieces.
But even with those fuzzy measurements, the potential match between Bazi's layout and what the inscription describes, pretty compelling.
It really is. And if that wasn't enough, there's another layer to this. Excavations at Banzi, they've uncovered something else. Evidence of some serious destruction.
Uh-oh. Sounds ominous.
And guess when this destruction seems to have happened?
Let me guess. Around the time Naram-Sin was conquering cities.
You got it. It's like a historical cliffhanger. But remember, this whole thing, it's not just about bricks and stones and ancient battlefields.
It's about understanding the bigger picture.
Exactly. The Epla tablets, they give us this amazing insight into Ari's role in the region. We're not just talking about a powerful city here. We're talking about a major player in this whole web of diplomacy, trade, conflict, you name it. This was the ancient Near East, after all.
Things were complicated back then.
You could say that again. But it makes you think, right? If army really is Armanum, what does that tell us about how news traveled, how influence spread back then?
I mean, this was a world without Twitter, without instant messaging, even without widespread literacy.
Exactly. But somehow, news of Naram-Sin's conquests, it reached people hundreds of miles away. So how did they do it? If army was this major power player, they must have had their own ways of getting the word out, of making their presence known.
It really changes how you think about ancient civilizations, doesn't it? We often think of them as being isolated, but they were actually incredibly interconnected.
Absolutely. They were linked by trade, diplomacy, and yes, sometimes by conflict, too. But it's important to remember, as compelling as the argument is for Banzi being Armanum, in archaeology and history, there are rarely easy answers.
It's not like they're going to find a sign that says, "Welcome to Armanum population," however many people lived there back then.
Right. But look, there have been other locations proposed for Armanum. Each one has its own arguments, its own evidence.
But right now, Banzi, it seems to be the front runner.
Based on what we know so far, absolutely.
Yeah.
But the debate, oh, it's far from over. New discoveries, new interpretations, these things can change everything.
That's what keeps things interesting, right? It really makes you think, you know?
Yeah.
Like, what else is out there? Just waiting to be discovered.
That's what I love about this field. It's like this never-ending conversation with the past, you know? And sometimes those conversations, they really make us rethink what we thought we knew, like with Armi and Armanum.
Because if they really are the same city, it changes things, right? It tells us a lot about how power shifted and changed in the ancient Near East.
Absolutely. The article we read, it even suggested that the reason Armi became so powerful might have been because Abla, remember that other city? Well, it was declining at the same time.
So as one empire weakens,
another one sees an opportunity. It's like a power vacuum, right? Happens all the time, even today.
history repeating itself.
And it's not just about, you know, who conquers what territory. Army, if it was this big player, they would have had a much wider influence. I'm talking trade, diplomacy, even cultural exchange.
It really shows how connected those ancient civilizations actually were, even without, like, the internet and phones and all that.
Exactly. And it reminds us that even in a world without instant communication, ideas, they could still spread. People were still influenced by things happening hundreds of miles away.
It's amazing when you think about it.
It really is. And those stories, those connections, they don't just vanish. They leave traces. Maybe it's a piece of a wall. Maybe it's an inscription on a stone. Or maybe it's words etched into clay, like those Ebla tablets.
It's up to us to find those traces, those whispers from the past, and try to piece together the story.
And maybe, just maybe, in learning about them, we learn a little bit about ourselves, too.
Well said. And on that note, folks, we're wrapping up another deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the heart of the ancient Near East. We'll catch you next time.